Today we're going to be looking at shared reading in kindergarten. We're going to be unpacking the guidance document. We're going to be looking at the purpose of shared reading in kindergarten, and then we're going to be looking at how you can make the best text selection for each part of the shared reading lesson plan. So when we look at your guidance document, there's a couple of different pieces that you can clump together to help you to make the best instructional decisions. When you're looking at this guidance document, the first thing you can really think about is how your phonological awareness and phonics pieces go together to help teach children how to read. These are really giving kids awareness of letter sounds and how they map onto letter print in order to help kids to be able to decode. The other part of shared reading is helping kids to have foundational reading behaviors. They're not necessarily actively teaching kids to decode, but they're giving kids oral language skills like vocabulary. They're teaching kids print concepts and giving them comprehension skills, and all of these things will teach kids to be readers eventually, but they're kind of giving them foundational reading skills and not actually teaching them to be decoders. So let's dig into each of these pieces a little bit more. Let's start with how to be a reader, since that's really the most important thing and where you should be spending the most of your time. Even though it's not actually looking like you're teaching kids to be a decoder for a big part of kindergarten, it is a big part of your shared reading time. And so a lot of what you're spending your time on is phonological awareness. These skills should be tied to your CCSD scope and sequence. You need to make sure you're providing explicit modeling, and so you might use a resource like 95% Group, especially using that I do model. And then you want to make sure you're providing kids with numerous opportunities to respond, and so a resource like Heggerty is really useful for something like that. The other piece that you want to make sure that you're including when you're teaching kids how to read would be the phonics piece. Again, you want to use the CCSD scope and sequence. The first part of your year would be teaching Jolly Phonics to help kids to learn their letter names and letter sounds. And then eventually throughout the year you would move on to VC and CVC words. This would be teaching kids the short vowel sounds and tying it to the closed syllable rules so that they understand why it has the short vowel sound. Just like with phonological awareness, you would want to make sure that you're doing explicit models and that kids would have numerous opportunities to respond. Now, both of these are considered teaching kids how to read, but it won't actually look like you're teaching kids how to read or active decoding until you get to the later half of the year when you're getting to those CVC words. So when you're teaching phonological awareness and phonics skills, it is teaching them how to read, but it's still going to look like a lot of teaching kids foundational skills or the pieces of reading and not actual decoding until later in the year. A lot of what it's going to look like you're doing is teaching kids foundational reading behaviors. You're going to be teaching them oral language skills like vocabulary. This vocabulary may not be actually located in the text, but it may instead be found in vivid illustrations. You're going to be teaching kids print concepts, whether that's directionality, the front and back of the text, punctuation, or things like this. You're going to want to make sure that you're teaching kids texts that have comprehension that you can discuss. You're going to want to focus on being able to teach kids how to ask and answer the W questions like who, what, when, where. You're going to want to use your power standards and focus on having kids identify setting, characters, beginning, middle, and end, and main idea and supporting details. Kids will want to be able to answer these questions and prompts outside of a text before they can apply them into the text. And then when you think about fluency, even though it's not an area of emphasis for kindergartners, we do have that listed in our guidance document. We want kids to be rereading a text to deepen their content knowledge, and we know that kindergarten texts may not have a lot of content that's really deep. So you want to think about when you're rereading a text the necessity of rereading it only as many times as would be necessary to pull out the content knowledge or to pull out new vocabulary. So for some stories, you may need to reread it 3 times. For some, you may need to reread it 5 times. In general, we would say that you would need to reread each text probably a minimum of 2 times and probably no more than 5 times. And it really is just based on the story for how many times you need to reread it to pull out as much content and vocabulary as would be appropriate for that story. So when you think about these two purposes or these 2 parts of a kindergarten story, we really get one clear purpose of shared reading in kindergarten, and that's to teach students the building blocks of foundational skills necessary to eventually scaffold up to being a reader. Students typically are not actively being asked to read the story or to memorize the text in the actual lesson. We're really just laying those foundations and teaching them these skills, and eventually once they get later in kindergarten or up into first grade, they're going to put those pieces together to be more of what we'd consider a typical reader. Our primary focus is developing those phonological awareness skills and those oral language or vocabulary skills. We're exposing them to rich texts so that they can start to develop an awareness of language, an awareness of sounds, an awareness of letters, so that eventually they can start to put them together and be a reader. Students will learn to read in a more traditional sense later in kindergarten with decodable text in the CVC pattern in phonics, later in a different portion of the lesson when we get to those phonics skills. So when we want to start thinking about picking texts that are appropriate for kindergarten, we want to focus on those foundational reading behaviors, since that's the main portion of the lesson when you have a text in front of kids. We want to focus on texts that have clear and varied illustrations, and that those illustrations can provide us with rich vocabulary, because a lot of our texts don't have rich vocabulary in the text itself. In fact, our texts typically have minimal text itself. Sometimes our stories don't have any text, but they have such rich illustrations that we can make up great stories and provide oral language in that way. And we want to make sure that the texts are really interesting to kids so that we can have great discussions around them and work on that oral language in that way. So thinking about these characteristics, I pulled out a kindergarten story, and I want us to analyze the story looking at these characteristics. The first thing we want to think about is, does this story have clear and varied illustrations? Well, there's some variation in the color, but there really isn't much variation in the illustrations themselves. The animal, even though it's changing from perhaps a lamb or a sheep to a cow, doesn't seem to change shape or form a lot. I would not say that there's much interest in these illustrations at all, and I can't pull hardly any vocabulary from these illustrations at all. There is minimal text from this story, but there wouldn't be much that I could talk about from this text. So in this case, I would not say that this is a good example for a kindergarten shared reading. Some people may look at this text and think that this is a great example of a text for kindergarten shared reading because they think kids could read this, they could memorize this, they could be successful for this, but that's really not the purpose for a kindergarten shared reading text. We want kids to be able to engage with the text. We want them to be able to have a discussion around the text. We want them to have an opportunity to engage around language with the text. And in this case, spring is here, the snow melts, the earth is fresh. There's not a lot that we could do with this. The illustrations don't provide much for us to go off of. So in this case, this would not be a good example of a text for us to use for kindergarten shared reading. Let's look at another example. Again, we want to look, are there clear and varied illustrations? Do the illustrations provide vocabulary? Is there minimal text? And is it high interest? Well, in this case, the illustrations have certainly improved. They're real photos, and so there's much more for us to talk about. There's more color, there's more texture, there's more movement. I could do a lot more dialogue about what I see. There's a little more text here. And even in the text, there's not so much vocabulary that I can necessarily pull out in the text itself. I could talk about the word season, and we could talk about what we would do in each of these seasons, but there's a lot more that I could talk about in the illustrations. I think the kids would be engaged with these photos, and we could talk about and make connections to what we would do. So while this may not be the absolute best text, this would probably still be something that would be appropriate, something that kids could make connections to, and something that I could end up making worthwhile within my kindergarten shared reading. Kids would find interest in this. There's not an overwhelming amount of text. The illustrations are engaging because the kids can make connections to it. They're colorful, there's texture to it, there's movement to it. This is something that we could find useful within our kindergarten shared reading. Let's find one last example. This is probably my favorite example of all of the three that I chose. Again, we're looking for clear and varied illustrations. Do the illustrations provide vocabulary? Is there minimal text or high interest text? Just to read some of the text, it says, each Monday at dawn, Mrs. Nellie McNosh brings out a barrel and does a big wash. It takes her all morning, and when the sun's high, she hangs what she's washed on the clothesline to dry. She hangs up a lamp and a large Christmas wreath, and Grandpa McNosh's removable teeth. Now, I think kids would be super engaged with this. It's a silly story. There's great vocabulary in the text itself. I could pull out words like barrel, clothesline, removable. There's words that we could pull out of the illustrations. I could talk about that wreath in that picture. We could talk about different types of clothing. The kids would be engaged. I think they'd be interested in the text. It's a silly text. We could talk about character development. This would be a challenging text for the kids to read. This would be a text that would be worth rereading all 5 days. We would go back and we would have to really focus on a page each day and talk about it. This would not be a text that I would expect kids to memorize, but again, that's not the purpose for this part of kindergarten shared reading. I am exposing kids to language. I am exposing kids to the comprehension skills. This part of my shared reading is really focusing on those foundational reading behaviors, which is comprehension and vocabulary and playing with words. So in this case, I think this would be a great kindergarten shared reading lesson, or a great kindergarten shared reading text, because it fits clear and varied illustrations. Each illustration is different. The illustrations provide vocabulary. The text is a little bit heavy on this middle page right here because there's text on both sides of the page. But other than that, each page it only has text on one side typically. And it's a very high interest text. It's very interesting for those kids. So for me, this is the best example out of the three when it comes to the foundational reading behaviors part of my kindergarten shared reading lesson. So just to summarize, the purpose of that part of that lesson that builds those foundational skills, that's not actually teaching kids decoding, but is building those foundational skills that will eventually teach kids how to be a reader and give them some of those background skills, is that it exposes them to vocabulary. It provides some of those oral language skills. It helps them to develop their comprehension skills, like teaching them about setting, characters, main idea, and supporting details, beginning, middle, and end. It helps them to develop their print concept knowledge. It's not to have them actually apply decoding skills or to memorize the text, which is why it's okay that it has some of that harder vocabulary. We're supporting them by scaffolding with a teacher read aloud and then echo reading and then choral reading. We're providing all those supports to help them to get through that challenging text that is still a kindergarten level text. And then it's not to have them develop fluency. We're only having them reread it as often as necessary to pull out some of that content knowledge and that rich vocabulary. If you're really choosing high leverage text, though, you may choose to reread it all 5 days of the week. If it's a text that maybe isn't as high leverage, you probably won't have them read it all 5 days. So then, if you're switching over to the second part of the guidance document, that part that's actually teaching them how to decode, which is really only going to start to appear in the second half of the year, you're going to have them work on some decodable text to teach that CVC pattern. It's going to be showing up in the phonics portion of your lesson. It's not going to be a text that's going to be reread. And you're going to start making some connections to the closed syllable type to help you to teach that short vowel sound. Now, in the first half of the year, when you're just working on Jolly Phonics, you're not going to have a second type of text. You're just going to use your Jolly Phonics instruction. But in the second half of the year, when you're working on the CVC pattern, you're probably going to need a decodable text to help to support that instruction. So in that case, you might use a text that would look something along this line. And so you notice it's a very simple text where it's focusing on a specific decodable pattern. It's not going to be something that has a lot of content or that is going to have rich vocabulary, rich illustrations even usually, which is why it's something that we're not rereading and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about comprehension. It's strictly there to help you to work on that CVC pattern. So again, reviewing the purpose for that particular part is to teach phonics patterns and to give students time for application. Students will be actively decoding and truly reading at this time. We're not rereading it because we're not working on fluency, and you're not going to spend time discussing vocabulary or comprehension because the text isn't meaty enough to do that. It is strictly time for application of that CVC pattern. And again, this is only going to happen towards the second half of the year when it's appropriate for you to be working on that CVC pattern. In the first half of the year, you're only going to have one text. It's that text that's working on those foundational skills that we've already talked about with the rich illustrations. and the vocabulary and the oral language skills. So let's see what that looks like all together for a second half of the year lesson when you actually might be juggling 2 texts when you have that CBC plan. So here is one lesson that has that Mrs. Mc. Start with your phonological awareness. I'm using a skill of adding initial phonemes. I have a very explicit I do, and I am using my 95% group to help me with that, but I'm only using the I do part of that to have that explicit language. For the we do, I switched over to Hegarty, but I'm keeping that focus on adding initial phonemes. I would use that for the words and for some of those routines, and then I made sure that I had the you do, so I have some time to test that skill. For distributive review, I continue to use Hegarty just so I could have kids continuing to practice some skills that were earlier on the scope and sequence and have some review. I continued that focus of adding initial phonemes continuing across my week so that we were focusing on the scope and sequence and drilling down on that skill. For my phonics portion, my scope and sequence told me that I was working on CVC short A, and so the way that I would do that is I was going to really focus on the short A sound in the word cap, and I would be explicit on teaching that short A sound and why in the CVC pattern the short A sound would appear in that word cap. Once I did that, though, I would branch out with the word family app and continue to build on there. I would continue with the short A sound in Sam and can, and I would kind of do a little bit to explain that nasal sound here. And then I would continue with the short A sound in cat, and then branch out with the word family at. But then by the end of this sequence, I would bring out the decodable text of Pam, can, nap, so that they could apply all of these short A sounds that we had learned about within that decodable text. Notice we wouldn't reread, we wouldn't talk about comprehension, but it would be a time for them to apply all of these short A sounds that we had worked on, where we had explicit instruction on why we had the short A sound, and practice with word families, and then applied it into a text. For our sight words for this particular string of lessons, we're working on she, up, and the because they appeared heavily in our text that focused on foundational skills then, with Mrs. Nellie McNosh hangs up her wash. We did some previewing skills, which had some of those concepts of print. And then for sequencing out our 3 days of rereading, we did a read aloud, then an echo read, and a choral read. Now for this, I only ended up reading it 3 days. With how rich that text is, I probably could have read it for all 5 days. I pulled out several different vocabulary words for each day that I read it. And then for comprehension, I worked on things like who was the main character, what was surprising about our character, what was the setting, and does the setting change? What does Mrs. McNosh all hang on her clothesline? What would someone normally hang on the clothesline? What would you hang on the clothesline? And then eventually into some of that sequencing and retelling. How did the story begin? Was there anything unusual about the beginning of the story? How did the story start to change in the middle? What did Mrs. McNosh hang up in the middle of the story? How did the story end? And then retelling that story. So that's kind of how I would sequence it, with those 2 separate stories for 2 separate reasons. We would end up working on our phonics skill here with that short A sound CBC pattern, and I would end up with a decodable text here just so I could focus on that short A sound. But then here would be that primary text that we would work on for some of those foundational skills for that oral language, that vocabulary, that comprehension, and some of those concepts of print. So, in summary, our purpose really is to teach kids the building block skills that they need, the phonological awareness, the vocabulary, the phonics, the comprehension, the print concepts, all of those foundational building block skills that they need necessary to scaffold up to be a reader when they're in kindergarten. We do a little bit to start putting that together at the end of kindergarten and actually teach them to be a reader, to be a decoder, but the majority of what you're doing in kindergarten shared reading will not actually look like them actively decoding. You are exposing them to language, you are putting words in front of them, you are having rich discussions about text, you are having them exposed to wonderful stories and engaging them around stories. You are teaching them to be readers and lovers of text is what you are doing, but a lot of what you are doing is not actually drilling them into being readers at this moment. end of kindergarten, they're starting to be readers and they're putting the words together and being decoders. A lot of what they're going to do, though, is they're going to pick those pieces up and they're going to start putting them together in their differentiated groups, and then in first grade. When you're thinking about text selection, that foundational reading behaviors is when you're going to use those really rich stories with clear and varied illustrations, illustrations that provide vocabulary with minimal text and high interest stories. It's still kindergarten level text, but you can still find really rich stories that are kindergarten level text with great vocabulary in those illustrations that you can pull out, those concept words that you can have great discussion around. As you get to the second half of the year, you can find some of those decodable CVC pattern books that you can put into the phonics portion of your shared reading so that kids can start to practice some of that decoding. These stories won't be reread, and you're going to start to make some connections to the closed syllable so that you can start to explain some of that short vowel sounds.